He had just returned from Iraq, but on his own streets, they greeted him like a criminal. A local police officer slapped handcuffs on his wrists, not even knowing who he was dealing with. This wasn't just any man. This was Colonel Adrian Mitchell, a soldier who had survived hell and now faced an even darker nightmare. As he stood there, trying to process the surreal situation, he wondered how things could unravel so quickly. It was supposed to be a quiet return, a chance to find some peace. Instead, it felt like he'd stepped into a battleground all over again. Adrian had just arrived back in Silver Ridge, a quiet Midwestern town where he'd grown up. He was 42, battle-hardened and weathered by years of war. After a grueling year in Iraq, all he wanted was a few days to breathe. Silver Ridge had always been his anchor, a place he thought would remind him of simpler times. Yet, as he walked its streets, nothing felt the same. The familiar storefronts, the park benches, the towering oaks lining Main Street, they all seemed foreign to him now. He felt disconnected, like a ghost in his own life. The war had taken more than his physical strength. It had severed the invisible threads that once tied him to this place. Adrian strolled through the quiet streets, his plan simple: keep walking, stop thinking. But what was supposed to be a calming walk turned into something much more unsettling. Around the corner near the old bakery, a police officer, a man Adrian didn't recognize, stepped into his path. The officer's expression was hard to read, but it wasn't friendly. The man's eyes carried a weight of judgment, as though Adrian had already committed some unspoken crime. "What are you doing here?" the officer asked, his tone sharp and accusatory. He adjusted his belt, his hand resting too casually on his holstered weapon. Adrian stopped, his pulse quickening. He'd faced down insurgents, seen death too many times to count, but something about this encounter left him uneasy. The officer wasn't just asking a question, he was issuing a challenge. "Just walking," Adrian replied, his voice steady but clipped. "Is that a problem?" The officer's lip curled into a sneer. "Depends. You think you can just stroll around here like you own the place?" Adrian frowned, taking a step back. "I live here," he said evenly, trying to keep his cool. "Just got back from deployment." The officer snorted. "Yeah? Well, you're not in Iraq anymore. This is my town, and I don't care where you've been." "In here." Before Adrian could respond, the officer grabbed his arm, yanking him toward the patrol car parked nearby. "Let's see some ID," the officer demanded, his grip firm. Adrian's heart raced as he reached for his wallet, but the officer's suspicion didn't waver. It was as though Adrian's very existence was an affront to him. "You've got to be kidding me," Adrian muttered under his breath, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He had survived ambushes, roadside bombs, and firefights, only to come home to this? His jaw tightened as he tried to stay calm, but the officer's disdain was pushing him to his limit. "You're under arrest for resisting," the officer declared suddenly, snapping handcuffs onto Adrian's wrists. The cold metal bit into his skin, and for a moment, Adrian was too stunned to react. Resisting? He hadn't even raised his voice. A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs filling the air. Among them was a young journalist, Emma Clark, who had been walking down the street when the scene unfolded. She pulled out her phone and began recording, her instincts kicking in. She didn't know who Adrian was, but something about the situation felt wrong. Her camera captured everything: the officer's aggressive tone, Adrian's calm yet frustrated responses, and the absurdity of the arrest. As the officer shoved Adrian into the back seat of the patrol car, Emma followed at a distance, still recording. Adrian sat in silence, the cuffs digging into his wrists. His mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. The officer's words echoed in his head. "This is my town." The drive to the station was tense. The officer glanced at Adrian in the rearview mirror, his expression smug. "You think your war stories mean anything here?" he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Out there, you might have been somebody, but here, you're just another guy who thinks he's above the law." Adrian clenched his jaw, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "I've spent my life defending this country," he said, his voice low but firm. "And this is how I get treated? Like a criminal?" The officer chuckled. "Save the speech. You're not special." By the time they arrived at the station, Adrian's frustration had reached its peak. He was dragged through the front doors, the officer's grip firm on his arm. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Other officers glanced at Adrian, their expressions a mix of curiosity and indifference. It was clear they didn't know who he was, and he doubted they cared. As he stood by the booking desk, the door to the station opened, and a man in a sharp suit strode in. He was tall, with an air of authority that silenced the room. His piercing gaze landed on Adrian, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Colonel Mitchell, I presume," the man said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "Who are you?" "Doesn't matter," the man replied. "What matters is that you've become quite the problem." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "A problem for who?" The man's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "For people who would rather you stay out of sight and out of mind. You're a reminder of things they'd rather forget." Before Adrian could respond, the man turned to the officer who had arrested him. "Release him," he ordered. The officer hesitated, clearly reluctant, but a single sharp glance from the suited man was enough to make him comply. Adrian rubbed his wrists as the cuffs were removed, his mind racing. "What's going on here?" he demanded. The man's expression remained unreadable. "Consider this a warning, Colonel. Stay quiet, stay out of sight, and maybe you'll avoid more trouble." Adrian's jaw tightened. "Is that a threat?" The man chuckled softly. "It's advice. Take it or leave it." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Adrian with more questions than answers. As Adrian stepped out of the station, Emma was waiting for him. She lowered her phone, her eyes filled with concern. "What just happened in there?" she asked. Adrian shook his head. "I wish I knew." Emma hesitated, then held up her phone. "I recorded everything. People need to see this." Adrian considered her words. Part of him wanted to let it all go, to retreat into the shadows and avoid any further trouble. But another part of him knew that staying silent would only enable the injustice he'd just experienced. "Do what you have to do," he said finally. "People deserve to know the truth." Over the next few days, Emma's footage went viral, sparking outrage across the country. Adrian's story became a rallying cry for veterans facing mistreatment and for anyone who had ever been unfairly targeted by those in power. As the media storm grew, Adrian found himself thrust into a spotlight he'd never sought. He didn't want to be a symbol, but he couldn't ignore the voices of support flooding in from across the nation. In the weeks that followed, Adrian worked to reclaim his place in Silver Ridge. He spoke at town halls, shared his experiences, and refused to let the actions of one officer define his return home. Slowly but surely, he began to feel a sense of belonging again. The war had changed him, but it hadn't broken him. And though his journey was far from over, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. Emma's role didn't end with the viral video. She took it upon herself to dig deeper into Adrian's story and the systemic issues it highlighted. Through interviews, articles, and her growing platform, she shone a light on the struggles many veterans faced when transitioning back to civilian life. Adrian became a reluctant advocate, joining her in panels and discussions that drew attention to the gaps in support for returning service members. His words carried the weight of lived experience, resonating with audiences who saw themselves in his journey. Meanwhile, the officer who had arrested Adrian found himself under scrutiny. The department launched an internal investigation, spurred by public outcry and pressure from higher-ups. Adrian's case became a catalyst for broader conversations about policing, authority, and accountability. As the town wrestled with these issues, Adrian found himself at the center of a movement he hadn't intended to start. He met with local leaders, veterans groups, and advocates, determined to turn his ordeal into something meaningful. Through it all, Adrian grappled with his own struggles. Nightmares of the war still haunted him, and the weight of his new role often felt overwhelming. But he found solace in the connections he built, with Emma, with fellow veterans, and with the community that began to rally around him. Silver Ridge wasn't just his hometown anymore. It became a place of healing, growth, and purpose. Months after that fateful day, Adrian stood on the steps of the town hall, addressing a crowd that had gathered for a community forum. His voice was steady as he spoke of resilience, justice, and the power of standing together. The journey that had begun with handcuffs now felt like a mission, one he was determined to see through. And as he looked out at the faces before him, he realized that the battle for dignity and understanding was one he could win, not with weapons, but with words, actions, and unwavering resolve.